Republicans and Democrats together had agreed upon.
Good Saturday morning to you. I'm Victor Blackwell.
I'm Leila Santiago, in for Christy Paul this morning.
For the third time this year alone, the U.S. government has shut down, at least partially. This is after lawmakers tried and failed to get the votes to pass a spending bill with border funding for the wall that the president wants. Midnight came and went.
So the question now, how long will this shutdown last? Thousands of federal workers may now have to wait, a lot of them continuing to report to work when all they want on that Christmas list, a paycheck.
Indeed. And now, the week after he told Democratic leaders that he would be proud to take the blame for a border wall shutdown, President Trump says it's the Democrats' fault. The shutdown caps a rough week for the White House after a dramatic court appearance from a former national security advisor, a resignation letter from the Secretary of Defense, and the worst week on Wall Street in a decade.
All right, listen, we are covering this from all angles this morning. Lots to talk about with CNN White House correspondent Abby Phillip and CNN national correspondent Suzanne Malveaux. Let's go ahead and start with Suzanne. Walk us through the last hours of the negotiation, what we should expect today, and how people are reacting.
Well, good morning. Sure, the lights are on here, but it's eerily quiet. What is going to happen is mostly behind the scenes, but we're told that the Senate will reconvene at noon. That is when we'll hear from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. But we expect much of what is going to happen is behind the scenes, private negotiations between Republicans as well as Democrats over the phone, making calls, trying to figure out if there is a deal to be made here. Most people have gone home. We are told that lawmakers will have 24 hours to be called back if it's necessary for a vote. But essentially, they're going to be trying to work out something. What happened last night, it was about 8:30 when folks essentially went home. That's after Cornyn, the whip, said that, look, we don't have the votes that are going to actually pass anything. And so what happened yesterday was that you had the Vice President, Mike Pence, as well as OMB Director Mick Mulvaney, as well as Jared Kushner, come here to the White House. They met with top Republicans as well as the Democrats to see if they could craft something. They did not come up with anything. Trump was insisting on the $5 billion for the border wall. There was $1.3 billion that was on the table as part of the current deal. Democrats did not budge from that. And then, as you might know, it was last week, just a couple days ago, really, when the president had agreed to a deal that both House and Senate said was okay, and he did as well, to $1.6 billion. That they didn't have the votes for anything on the Senate side, and they needed that 60 votes. None of the Democrats went along with that. And now what you have is the blame game that continues to go on. A statement from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, essentially saying that this is the Trump shutdown and that they will do everything in their power when the Democrats have majority in the House come January to get the government open as quickly as possible. One of the breakthroughs that did happen yesterday, and Pence did break this tie, is essentially to keep the negotiations continuing, to keep the debate going on. But the key questions now are going to be, will the president accept anything less than the $5 billion? What kind of language would that be? How long will this take? Is this something that could happen the next 48 hours? And then finally, is the president's word worth anything here? They had a deal that everyone had agreed to, including the president, days ago, and it was basically blown up. And so if they come forward and say, this is the deal that we're going to vote on, and there is no other deal that we're going to vote on but this one, will the president stick to that deal, or will he try something else again? That is what lawmakers are asking themselves this morning.
Yeah, it's a very fair question, Suzanne Malveaux. Thank you so much.
President Trump says he canceled a trip to Florida so he could stay in Washington to wait for Democrats. That's the word from the president. CNN White House correspondent Abby Phillip joins us now. More than waiting for Democrats, we heard Suzanne there talked about the vice president, the acting chief of staff, the senior advisor going up to try to chart the way forward on the negotiations. Are they moving forward? And, what more is the president doing?
Well, it's not entirely clear, Victor, if there is real progress being made. And the question of what President Trump himself is doing is a really important one. This is as you know, the person who prides himself on being the deal maker in chief, but he has been here in the White House while others has shuttled back and forth between the House and Senate side on Capitol Hill on his behalf, trying to make a deal. One of the things that we have heard coming out of those negotiations is that the president still wants to push for a substantial amount of border security funding. Exactly how much that will be is anyone's guess at this point, but one of the senses that we are getting is that it is not likely to be the $5 billion that he pushed for in the House bill. Meanwhile, the president here at the White House, as you mentioned, canceled that trip to Florida, but he's also been very busy trying to rebrand this shutdown, which just a week ago he claimed he would take full credit for. Listen to what he said in a video that the White House produced and put out yesterday.
Call it a Democrat shutdown, call it whatever you want, but we need their help to get this approved. So Democrats, we have a wonderful list of things that we need to keep our country safe. Let's get out, let's work together, let's be bipartisan, and let's get it done. The shutdown hopefully will not last long.
In any event, most of what he said in that video really contradicts what he's been saying all week. In fact, he said on Twitter just yesterday that he believed that if there was a shutdown, it would last long. And the president has not been clear about where he is willing to compromise in terms of border security funding. All that being said, it just leaves us feeling in many ways like Washington is trying to get to a compromise, but both sides are still not talking with any great detail about what exactly it would take to end this shutdown. President Trump still isn't going to Florida, but you do get the sense here at the White House that the minute that this situation is resolved, he will be heading down there. And clearly he is eager to do that. He talked quite a bit about how he has canceled his Air Force One flight down there. Meanwhile, Melania Trump, the First Lady, and the president's son, Barron Trump, are still heading to Florida to spend the Christmas break at Mar-a-Lago. Victor and Layla.
Abby Phillip, thanks so much.
So more than just the back and forth between politicians, what is really at stake during this shutdown? Well, at least 420,000 federal workers will expected to work without pay until lawmakers can make a deal. About 380,000 employees will be placed on furlough as we head into the Christmas holidays.
Essential services, so we're talking about things like Social Security, will still get funded. You can expect your mail to be delivered. That's always important this week. Federal employees who keep people safe, we're talking about the military, law enforcement officers, those will keep working.
Now, as we said, those 420,000 employees working without pay, behind that number, there are families who may be living paycheck to paycheck, and the paycheck they were counting on may be coming late.
So let's go ahead and bring in Randy Irwin from Washington. He is the national president of the National Federation of Federal Employees. Randy, thanks so much for being with us this morning. Let's just start with, what are your members telling you? What's the biggest concern right now?
Well, they're really concerned about losing their paychecks. Sure. It's really sad that this is happening around the holidays. Government shutdown means that those 380,000 workers that you're talking about are going to be without pay, and they weren't really prepared for this. And so, they've bought all their Christmas presents. They've put money on their credit cards, and they don't know how. Now they're not sure how they're going to make the rent. They're not sure because if they don't have a paycheck coming, and who knows how long it could last, they're not going to be able to keep the heat on. They're concerned about their mortgage. It's a lot of concerns. These are real people who have real families and real financial obligations, and they just had the carpet ripped out from under them with this shutdown and this furlough.
So, Randy, Democratic leaders in Congress call this the Trump shutdown. The president now says the Democrats own the shutdown. This is after last week when he said that he would be proud to take up the mantle of shutting down the government for border security. Who does NEFI, your organization, think is responsible for what we're seeing now?
This is Trump's shutdown. I mean, let's be real here. There was months and months to work out some kind of a negotiation. And the truth is, he just doesn't have the votes for the border wall. And because of that, he's putting everybody in a predicament, forcing this shutdown, doing it around the holidays. And he's obviously being supported by the Republicans in Congress. Now, we're an organization that works equally with both Republicans and Democrats. It's the way we operate. We need to do that to best advocate for our members. So for us, it's not a partisan thing. But let's be real. They're shutting down the government, and Trump has taken ownership, and he's the one that deserves the credit for it.
Randy, your organization represents 110,000 employees. You were saying many of them were caught off guard. So I'm going to assume that many of them had hoped a deal would go through before midnight. What is the outlook? What is the hope? Are they hopeful something will change before January 3rd, before there's a new control in the House?
Well, I think they are hopeful, but you know, you really can't prepare that way. I mean, you can hope, but if you got to feed your family and get through the holidays, I mean, people kind of assume that this shutdown isn't going to go on for very long. Well, the president's out there saying he wants this to be a long shutdown. So that means an even long for people who are living paycheck to paycheck. And let me tell you, we got a lot of people in our organization. Some are making as little as $27,000 a year. They are. They cannot sustain a cutoff of their income for any period of time. So they have to plan as though they're not, it doesn't matter if they're going to get paid a month later. They have to plan as though it's not coming. And the other thing is, in the past, Congress, thankfully, when there's been a furlough, has paid workers who've been furloughed. There's no guarantee of that. And so for a worker who's being furloughed, you got to plan as though your revenue is shut off and it's never coming. And for a family who's making in the 20,000, 30,000, low 40 kind of range, this is just pulling the carpet out from under them, and you can't really plan for that.
Well, the expectation is that once the government gets up and running at 100%, is that Congress will, as part of the legislation to get the government open again, or open the government, will reimburse the federal workers for back pay. I mean, that is your expectation, right?
It is our expectation, but we have seen efforts in the past, thankfully, that have been thwarted. But there will be an effort by some in Congress to make federal employees pay for the dysfunction here in Washington. Let
me get one more in here. You talked about preparation and planning, and there are several degrees and categories of preparation. The family preparing for potentially being without income, but also the preparation from the departments, from the administration. What degree of communication was there headed up to midnight so that people knew who would be required to or requested to show up and work, who would be impacted and affected, and those who would not?
It's some of the worst preparation that we've seen. When there's been shutdowns in the past, there were weeks leading up to it, in the days ahead of time. As employee representatives, we were having conference calls with the agencies, and how it was going to be rolled out was very clear. Where this time around, 2 days ago, people thought that there probably wasn't going to be a shutdown. You weren't seeing the behaviors from the agencies that you would have really expected. And I was talking to a lot of people in our organization. I had to talk to a lot of members, and a lot of them had no idea whether they were going to be furloughed, whether they were on the accepted list, so they weren't going to be furloughed. So the preparation was very, very poor this time around. Everybody was caught with their pants down.
Wow, great insight. Randy Irwin, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So in addition to the shutdown and what we saw at the Department of Defense, this was also the worst week on Wall Street in almost a decade. Investors, they're just looking for some relief, and a lot of people are wondering when this slide will end. We'll talk more about that.
Plus, is the acting attorney general already in the president's doghouse? And this is just weeks after being on the job. Details on that next.
Well, any honeymoon period for acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker did not last long. CNN has learned President Trump has ripped into Whitaker at least twice in the last few weeks. Multiple sources say the president was frustrated that federal prosecutors, whom Whitaker oversees, filed charges against Michael Cohen that made the president look bad. None of the sources suggested the president directed Whitaker to stop the investigations. The top Democrat on the House Intel Committee found the news unsettling. Adam Schiff tweeted, "The president of the United States should not be discussing any criminal case in which he has been implicated with the acting attorney general. This is wrong, unethical, and eviscerates post-Watergate policy." Whitaker should not need an ethics opinion to know this is inexcusable.
The Supreme Court has dealt a bit of a blow to the Trump administration's new asylum ban. See, Friday, the High Court upheld an order by a federal judge in California that blocks the policy. It would have temporarily banned migrants who illegally cross into the U.S. through the southern border from seeking asylum outside of those official ports of entry. A district court ruled that the ban conflicts with immigration law. And here's an interesting tidbit. Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the four liberals on this one with a 5-4 ruling. The Justice Department plans to continue fighting for the ban. And it was a very rough end to an awful week on Wall Street. And President Trump, well, he's not so happy about that. The Dow closed down 414 points on Friday. For the week, it fell 6.9%. And that's the deepest weekly plunge since the recession in 2008. President Trump blames the Fed chair for the downfall. And according to Bloomberg, Trump is even thinking about firing Jerome Powell, blaming higher interest rates for the market hits.
CNN's Money and Politics reporter Christina Leschi has more from the stock exchange. Christina, good morning to you.
Victor, Layla, a brutal week in the market. The Dow and the S&P now on track for their worst December since the Great Depression and their worst yearly performance in a decade. This week, the selling began in earnest on Wednesday when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. Investors got really nervous that the central bank was weaning this economy off of easy money. Look, we've had historically low interest rates now for over 10 years, and that's helped boost the economy. When interest rates are low, consumers are more incentivized to buy houses and cars, and of course, stocks. Rising interest rates might have the opposite impact. That is what spooked Wall Street. Add to that, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell disappointed investors by making it sound like more interest rate hikes were already baked in for 2019. And that sent the market even lower. Adding to the negativity, President Trump, who tweeted on Thursday that he was willing to partially shut down the government over border wall funding. Even after one of his economic advisors tried to assure the market that a short and partial shutdown would not have lasting economic impact, the president took to Twitter to emphasize the shutdown could be long. On Friday, the Federal Reserve tried to repair some of the damage. New York Fed president clarifying that the Fed will monitor what's going on in the financial markets and future hikes really depend on economic data. But overall, a very volatile week for Wall Street that ended with investors still deeply concerned about the impact of the ongoing trade war with China, a global economic slowdown, and the stimulus from the tax cuts wearing off. Victor, Layla.
Christina, thank you. Right now, the U.S. government is partially shut down. Thousands of employees getting hit in the wallet. We'll look at who's affected and how long this could last.
Plus, the news that sent shockwaves around the world really triggered alarm bells in Washington. We're learning new details about President Trump's reaction to the resignation of James Mattis. For the third time this year, the government partially shut down this morning after the White House and Congress failed to reach a deal to keep it funded. At issue here, a highly charged fight over money for President Trump's border wall. Lawmakers tried to make a deal, but it's still kind of unclear how close they are to striking any sort of agreement, sparking concerns that this may last well after the new year.
So who is affected? Well, 75% of the government already has funding in place through this coming fall. But in various departments and agencies, 420,000 government employees are now working without pay. Let's go through them. At Homeland Security, 55,000 TSA workers will remain at their posts. 55,000 Custom and Border agents and the officers are without pay, too. Well, they will stay there, too. At Transportation, 24,000 air traffic controllers remain on the job, so will railroad inspectors. At the State Department, passports will be issued, but not at every passport office and at government facilities where workers are furloughed and the offices are closed, obviously. The Smithsonian Museum in D.C. are still open through January 1st on a regular schedule, but it's unclear what happens beyond the 1st. The Justice Department will mostly remain open and operate. The Russia investigation will certainly continue. In addition, the Agriculture Department will continue food safety inspections, but other services stop, like research. And folks at NASA, they're put on leave of absence without pay. Now, at the Interior Department, the national parks, some services at parks are closed as well, like restrooms and visitor centers.
So joining me now to discuss further, reporter and co-author of Political Playbook, Daniel Lippman. Good morning to you, Daniel.
Good morning.
All right,
Thanks for having me.
Let's get right into the back and forth. We just heard from the representative of thousands of federal workers talking about how this is real. These are families waiting for a paycheck. So what do we expect it will take for a deal to be made here?
So negotiations are going to start again later today. But what it's going to take is that Trump and Republicans who are in the Freedom Caucus, they'll have to accept that they're not going to get billions of dollars for their border wall. It's going to have to be labeled border security funding or, a fence or anything that just does not include the word wall. That is just unacceptable to Democrats, and they feel like they have America on their side since they won the midterm elections in the House. And so, Trump has accepted caves on this before, and he looked until earlier this week that he would accept a deal until he got so much criticism from the right that he worried that he might lose his base in 2020.
Give me insight on both sides here. Why do some believe this makes him look strong, while others believe this makes him look weak? Why two extremes here? Why do we see belief on both ends?
So I think for people who view Trump as weak in this is that Republicans still control the whole of government, and yet they can't even keep the lights on. That's kind of the argument for saying that there have been 3 shutdowns in the last couple of years. You have this repeated fight, and it just does not go away because Trump is obsessed with the border wall. And it's a $25 billion project, and very little of it has been actually appropriated. For those who view this as making Trump look strong, is that until a couple days ago, when he indicated he would not budge, many people thought that he was going to get rolled. Remember, Ann Coulter said, "This is the end of your presidency." This is very dangerous because one of your prime promises during the 2016 campaign that got voters on your side was to build a wall and to protect the country. And yet that has not happened under President Trump.
We see the clock there ticking on the amount of time that the partial shutdown has now been in place. That's also ticking toward when Democrats will take over in the House. So January 3rd, we'll see a big change. Do you think that plays a role here in how Democrats and Republicans approach this?
I think it definitely does, because Trump's leverage for getting border wall money only decreases as that January 3rd date approaches, because Nancy Pelosi, when she's Speaker of the House, will not accept any border wall money or even less border security money. And I think both sides also feel like this is a limited shutdown. This is not open-ended, because every expectation is that if it continues until January 3rd, the first act of Nancy Pelosi in power will be to, get the government lights back on. And so during the holidays, the pressure is not there. And plus, many of those Republicans who were defeated, they don't seem that interested in making a deal. They just want to get on with their lives and, get their next post-congressional gig.
Right. In the meantime, 800,000 workers dealing with uncertainty right now. Daniel Lippman, thank you so very much. So how are federal workers dealing with that shutdown? In the next hour, we will talk to the policy director of the American Federation of Government Employees. More insight there.
President Trump angry over Defense Secretary James Mattis's resignation, but it's not his departure that has the president fuming. 38 minutes after the hour now, President Trump is angry over Defense Secretary Jim Mattis's resignation letter. A source close to the White House tells CNN that the president, quote, hates the letter, but hates the coverage more. He's upset that Mattis was often called one of the adults in the room. Now, General Mattis's abrupt resignation stunned U.S. allies, took all of Washington by surprise. And it came right after the president's announcement to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. Let's talk about all of this. Here with me now, Rebecca Grant. She is a national security and military analyst and the president of the IRIS Independent Research, and Rear Admiral John Kirby, CNN military and diplomatic analyst. Welcome back, both of you. And let me start here with you, Admiral Kirby. The Guardian and the Washington Post are reporting, and this gets to both the Syria decision and General Mattis, that it was that call with Turkish President Erdogan a Friday ago, so a week ago yesterday, in which there was the exchange that Erdogan said, I don't know why you still have U.S. troops in Syria. You say you've won. Why are you backing the Kurds there in Syria? And the president said, you're right, it's yours, I'm getting out. How does that correspond with the letter that General Mattis submitted with his resignation, talking about those strategic competitors and malign actors?
Yeah, it shows what the real dissonance was between Trump and Mattis with respect to what we were doing in Syria, and more broadly, Victor, on the power resident in alliances and partnerships. It also shows some of the schizophrenia of Turkey over this whole issue. I mean, they have bristled at the support we've been giving to Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish fighters, because they view most of those Kurdish fighters as terrorist groups. On the other hand, they've kind of quietly welcomed American presence there in northeastern Syria because it has tended to keep Russia and the Assad regime and, quite frankly, ISIS fighters away from their border, although they're not that worried about ISIS. So they're suffering a little bit of paranoia on this as well.
So, Rebecca, from your perspective, I read in your conversations with my producers is that you don't believe some of the concerns, or you don't agree with some of the concerns that both Democrats and Republicans have expressed about the president's decision to pull out the U.S. troops there of Syria.
Well, the first point I'd like to make is that a lot is staying in the region. We'll have air power in Jordan and Qatar in the UAE. We have Navy forces. Special ops are ready to engage at any moment. There are 1,000 French forces still on the ground. So we still have a commitment there and the ability to come back and bring in firepower whenever we need to. And I think finally the Admiral is right, and Turkey just couldn't take it anymore. And Trump has to consider that our Mideast policy really rests on Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia. Not a happy trio, but there we have it.
Rebecca, listen here to this interview. Wolf Blitzer spoke with Stephen Miller, senior advisor to the president, and how he frames the U.S.'s involvement in Syria and the enemies there that the U.S. was fighting. Watch and listen.
Let's defend our national security. Let's put America first, but let's not spill American blood to fight the enemies of other countries, as is the case in Syria.
The enemies of other countries there in Syria. Do you think that's the appropriate framework for the work that the U.S. military has been doing in Syria?
Well, the U.S. military is working with our coalition. The Defeat ISIS coalition consists of almost 70 countries and NATO and other groups. So I don't really agree with that, and I think we put a lot into it. And don't forget, the reason that we had to extend operations up into Syria was to retake Iraq. That's been accomplished. We still have 5,000 American forces in Iraq. And the Mattis strategy of surge last year in Syria has worked. Right now we're down to about 2,000 ISIS fighters. They control less than 1% of the territory, according to the coalition's report of December 4th. So Mattis did achieve a lot with his policy in Syria.
Admiral, has the U.S. been fighting other countries' enemies in Syria?
No, I mean, in fact, the idea that Stephen Miller puts is ridiculous. Russia, Iran, Turkey, Assad have never really been all that serious about fighting ISIS or or al-Qaeda derivatives inside Syria. Their focus has largely been on propping up the Assad regime so that they can have, particularly Russia and Iran, can continue to use Syria for their own national interests. Russia wants a foothold in the Middle East. It's been their only foothold for decades. Iran wants a throughway to support Hezbollah in Lebanon. So they're not interested in fighting ISIS. We've not been fighting other people's enemies. ISIS is a global enemy. And as was pointed out, the coalition is now 74 nations strong. It's an international effort. So it's very much on behalf of our own national security interests and the interests of so many other countries around the world with which we partner.
All right, Admiral Kirby, Rebecca Grant, thank you both.
Thank you.
So Secretary Mattis isn't the only one upset with the president's desire to reduce U.S. forces in Afghanistan. One Republican senator who just returned from there says pulling out now could lead to another 9/11.